The land looks quiet at first glance, as if it has always belonged to the present moment. But when the night deepens and the world slows its breathing, another layer of reality begins to emerge. The prairies stretch outward like a vast, unmoving sea, yet beneath their grasses lie stories pressed flat by time. Forests hum with a silence older than memory, their roots threading through forgotten hearths and shattered fragments of lives no one recalls. Even the deserts, empty and unbroken, hide the outlines of trails worn by feet that passed long before any surviving name was spoken. In this stillness, the continents feel older than we allow ourselves to imagine. They carry the weight of history's erase so thoroughly that only the soil remembers them. A thin fog rolls along an unseen riverbank, drifting as softly as smoke from ancient fires that once warmed people whose faces we will never reconstruct. These quiet scenes create a subtle tension, the sense that North and South America were never untouched, never waiting for discovery, but already shaped by civilizations swallowed by the deep layers of time. Modern cities do their best to cover this truth. Towers rise over buried campsites, highways cross forgotten migration routes. 1,000 unmarked stories lie beneath sidewalks and basements, sealed away under concrete and ambition. Sometimes, after a heavy rain, a fragment surfaces, a shard of worked stone, a broken tool, a pattern carved into bone. These are not messages left for us. They are echoes, reminders that our timeline is only one thin line drawn across a far wider canvas. The questions begin to form quietly, almost shyly. Who walked these lands before the cultures we celebrate emerged? How many nations lived entire ages, flourished, struggled, and vanished long before the first Olmec mask or Maya stela was carved? The silence does not answer, yet it invites the mind to wander. It suggests the possibility that our picture of the past is only a fraction of what once existed. As the narrator drifts across river valleys and shadowed canyons, the landscape becomes a kind of memory palace, holding whispers of rituals performed in languages no human voice has spoken for thousands of years. A faint sensation follows, the uncomfortable realization that the earliest chapters of American history may be missing, not because they never happened, but because time has taken them back. Erosion, floods, shifting earth, and the delicate nature of early human settlements have conspired to hide entire worlds from us. Yet the land still feels full, as if carrying secrets just beneath the threshold of perception. And so the silence becomes an invitation. It urges us to look closer, to listen more carefully, to consider that the truth may be far older than the stories we have learned. From this quiet foundation, the search for the faintest surviving clues begins, clues that will guide us deeper into the forgotten world beneath our feet. The deeper one looks into the ancient Americas, the more unsettling the silence becomes. Not the peaceful silence of untouched wilderness, but a quieter, sharper kind, an absence that feels deliberate, as if time itself swept a vast broom across the continents and carried whole civilizations away. Archaeology depends on what survives, yet most of human life is made from things that do not. Wood crumbles, cloth dissolves, earth lodges melt back into the soil that shaped them. Floods erase footprints as if they were never pressed into the ground. Over thousands of years, even stone fractures, scatters, and hides beneath layers of wind-blown dust. What remains is not a record of everything that once existed, but the tiny fraction resilient enough to withstand nature's slow forgetting. It is easy to imagine that nothing existed if nothing remains. The modern mind craves certainty, neat timelines, and labeled artifacts. But the land offers none of these comforts. Instead, it holds gaps, vast stretches of time where people must have lived, traveled, built, loved, and feared, yet left behind almost nothing for us to recover. These invisible societies become what the narrator calls ghost cultures, not because they were supernatural, but because they slipped so deeply into the earth that only their absence lingers. History shows this pattern again and again. For centuries, no one believed that early monumental architecture existed before farming until a hill in Turkey revealed the stone rings of Göbekli Tepe. Europe was certain of its first towns, until Çatalhöyük emerged from the dust to rewrite the story. Entire populations migrated across ancient land bridges, leaving nearly no trace except faint genetic signatures still carried in living people. These examples whisper an uncomfortable truth. The lack of evidence is never the same as the lack of existence. The Americas magnify this problem. The environments that nurtured early human life, dense forests, river plains, wetlands, are also the most efficient at erasing it. A wooden settlement beside an ancient lake could vanish in a single season. A storm could shift a river, burying a village beneath silt that hardens like stone. Fires, droughts, and ice ages all played their part in wiping clean the earliest chapters of human presence. What we find are not ruins but hints. A solitary tool far older than expected, a scatter of bones with no cultural relatives, a pattern on a hillside that looks too straight to be natural. The puzzle we face is missing nearly every piece, yet its outline faintly persists. It forces us to approach the past with humility, recognizing that we may be standing atop the erased world of countless forgotten nations. These cultures live on only in silence, testing our willingness to imagine what is no longer visible. As the dust of vanished civilizations settles in the mind, the search moves toward the few surviving traces that escaped time's erasure clues, preserved not in stone, but in the deeper layers of genetics, language, and landscape. The land holds memories in ways human voices cannot. Even when people move on, the ground beneath them continues to shape and reshape what it once carried. Rivers carve new paths, as if trying to wash away forgotten trails, yet sometimes their bends look intentional, echoing the roots of ancient travelers. A dry creek bed may once have framed a settlement, its stones still arranged in patterns too subtle to register consciously. Hills roll gently across open plains, but a careful gaze detects the curvature of something older mounds, softened by centuries of wind, outlines blurred by grass and rain, yet still holding the quiet geometry of hands no one remembers. Seen from above, the landscape reveals more. Geometric shadows appear in forests, where no documented cultures built such shapes. Lines stretch across deserts, visible only when light strikes at certain angles. Terraces hide beneath layers of soil, forming steps that no farmer alive today carved. These features behave like whispers, their presence soft but persistent, urging the curious mind to consider what the land itself has chosen to keep. This ancient surface behaves like a palimpsest, its stories written, erased, and overwritten by generations who knew nothing of the ones before. A village replaces an older camp. A ceremonial site becomes a pasture. A path widens into a road, burying a deeper trail that once guided an entirely different people. Even untouched wilderness may be less untouched than it appears. The roots of trees push aside pottery shards and forgotten tools, carrying them upward 1 inch at a time as if the forest wants to return these memories to air. Indigenous stories strengthen this sense of layered presence. Across the continents, tribes speak of earlier beings not mythic in the fantastical sense, but older, quieter, and sometimes profoundly human. Some describe giants whose steps shaped valleys. Others recall nimble forest dwellers who taught early skills before vanishing. Many speak simply of the first ones, a people who walked the land before their ancestors arrived. These traditions do not compete with archaeology, they support what the earth suggests. They remind us that not all history survives as objects. Some survives as echoes carried in memory, mixed with reverence and caution. Each landscape becomes a guardian of these ancient threads. Mountains hide footprints in fractured stone. Marshes bury wooden posts that once held dwellings. Dry basins preserve pollen from vanished fields. All across the Americas, quiet places hold fragments of stories that no historian can fully reconstruct. Yet the feeling remains. Something lived here long before recognized civilizations took shape. As this chapter closes, the whispers in the land invite us to listen more carefully. They urge us to step beyond the comfort of recorded history and look for clues that survived only because the earth itself protected them. The next step of the journey begins with following these faint traces into deeper, more tangible evidence. In that quiet search, the landscape becomes our first guide towards stories waiting to be uncovered now. Long before the civilizations we know, the Olmec sculptors, the Maya astronomers, the Mississippian mound cities, there were ages that left no records behind. The continents were already alive with people, though their stories now drift beyond the reach of history. They traveled across grasslands that no longer exist, hunted animals long vanished, and watched climates rise and fall with a quiet resilience. These early wanderers lived in a world so different from ours that even its sky would have seemed unfamiliar. Yet they walked the same land, paused at the same rivers, and looked across the same horizons we see today. Their presence formed the earliest human layers on the American continents, though time has thinned those layers until only traces remain. As the narrator moves gently through this forgotten era, the darkness becomes a kind of fog, dense, soft, and strangely full. Nothing is fully visible, yet something unmistakable moves within it. Oral traditions across the Americas speak of the first peoples, of builders who raised structures that later cultures only remembered in story, or of nations who lived briefly and disappeared completely. Some tales describe strangers encountered in the deep past, different in language or form, who vanished when the world changed. These stories do not demand literal interpretation. Instead, they offer a quiet suggestion. Human presence here may be older than the timelines we usually accept. Archaeology provides scattered hints that support this idea. Ancient footprints in soft sediment that hardened into stone. Tools found far older than expected, buried beneath layers untouched by human hands for tens of thousands of years. Campsites perched on ancient shorelines long since swallowed by glacial melt. These discoveries do not shout, they whisper. Each suggests that the earliest chapters of the Americas were rich with human life, yet nearly all of it slipped through time without leaving structures or inscriptions behind. The absence is not emptiness. It is simply what happens when people live lightly on the land, when climate reshapes valleys, when fires sweep across forests, when water rises and rewrites coastlines. Countless generations grew up, grew old, loved, feared, built, and died without leaving anything we would recognize as evidence. Their civilizations did not vanish because they failed. They vanished because time is a patient eraser. The emotional truth becomes clear. Before the civilizations that fill textbooks, there were worlds we cannot fully imagine. They lived in the long dawn of human presence, shaping the land in ways visible only through faint environmental traces, and the quiet memories of descendants who preserved fragments in ritual and story. As Chapter 1 closes, the fog begins to thin. A shape still distant, still blurred, starts to emerge. The next chapter follows the first threads of tangible evidence that survived time's erasure, guiding us toward cultures older and more mysterious than our timelines admit. If the soil hides the structures of forgotten nations, then the blood carries their final whispers. In the quiet world of ancient DNA, stories appear that were never written down, mapped, or remembered. They come from frozen remains found in high mountain caves, from bones preserved in dry shelters, from fragments of tissue uncovered in melting ice. Each sample reveals a thread of human presence that does not match the cultures we know. Some lineages appear abruptly in the record, as if an entire population stepped briefly into view before dissolving into time. Others persist faintly into the present, carried in the genomes of people who may have never heard the names of their ancient ancestors. The narrator walks gently through this strange terrain where science confronts its own uncertainties. Genetic patterns show unexpected divergences, groups that split from known populations far earlier than expected, or connections between distant regions that seem too old to belong to recognized migrations. In the Amazon, isolated communities carry lineages that appear unrelated to later indigenous groups. In the far north, ancient remains reveal genetic signatures that vanish after a brief window, leaving no clear descendants. And across the continents, faint similarities emerge between populations, separated by enormous distances, suggesting networks far older than recorded history. These discoveries do not rewrite the story in bold strokes. Instead, they create delicate ripples. They imply that the earliest peoples of the Americas may have been far more diverse than the archaeological record suggests. Some groups left no monumental architecture. Others may have traveled widely but sparsely, leaving only their genetic shadows behind. And many lived in ecosystems where preservation was nearly impossible, their homes and belongings reclaimed by forests, glaciers, and shifting rivers. The tone remains calm and grounded, reminding the viewer that ancient DNA is a fragile field, full of partial signals and incomplete insights, yet its mysteries are real. Science does not easily explain populations that seem to appear and vanish without leaving the cultural footprints expected of long-lived societies. These genetic signatures feel like echoes from nations that existed long enough to shape the human tapestry, but not long enough to carve their stories into stone. What lingers most is the feeling of standing at the edge of a map drawn only in faint lines. The blood remembers what the land forgets. It carries clues to migrations that happened before known timelines, encounters between groups that archaeology has never recorded, and brief flashes of civilization swallowed by climate, disaster, or assimilation. As the echoes fade, a new question rises. If these forgotten bloodlines existed, what else did they leave behind? The next step in the search leads us away from DNA and into the realm of objects, tools, and artifacts that appear older, stranger, and more challenging than the timelines we have grown comfortable with. Across the Americas, scattered in unlikely places, lie objects that feel both ordinary and unsettling. A chipped blade found beneath a riverbank where no known settlement stood. A polished stone point emerging from a layer older than any recognized cultural horizon. A fragment of worked rock discovered deep within a cave, far from light, far from habitation, its purpose worn smooth by time. These tools are simple, yet their presence disrupts our sense of sequence. They exist without the context that should surround them. No hearths, no homes, no discarded pottery, no bones belonging to the people who shaped them. They seem to drift alone through the archaeological record, like ghosts carrying memories of hands we cannot trace. The narrator moves through this landscape of objects, with the soft, investigative tone of a night-wandering storyteller. There is no rush to reach conclusions. Instead, the attention lingers on the puzzle itself, how tools can survive while everything else connected to them disappears. A flood can sweep away dwellings but spare the stones resting beneath heavier silt. An earthquake can bury a village whole, leaving only the densest objects preserved. A river can shift course over generations, erasing entire human lifetimes, and depositing the occasional artifact far from its original setting. These natural accidents shape the story far more than human intention. Some stone constructions complicate the picture further. Isolated walls, platforms, or alignments appear in regions where no established culture was expected during the periods suggested by their age. Their craftsmanship is subtle, not monumental, but precise enough to raise quiet questions. Who carved these shapes into bedrock? Who transported stones across miles of uneven land? Who practiced this level of skill at a time when local archaeology shows little sign of organized societies? The structures do not shout for attention, they whisper, inviting only the patient listener to consider their origins. The viewer is encouraged to imagine the hands behind these objects, individuals shaping tools beside rivers now lost, families building temporary shelters whose materials melted back into the earth, small groups carrying traditions that never grew into large civilizations, yet still possessed artistry, knowledge, and purpose. Their lives unfolded fully, as vivid and complex as any in history, yet time erased every trace except the stones they touched. These tools become a reminder of how thin the archaeological record truly is. For every object we find, countless others dissolved long before discovery. For every tool that survives, entire cultures may have vanished without leaving so much as a footprint. The mystery is not in the artifacts themselves, but in the silence that surrounds them. As the narrative moves forward, the story shifts from objects carved in stone to stories carved in memory. The next clues come not from the ground, but from the voices of those who preserved ancient truths long after the makers of these tools faded from the world. Long before archaeology sifted through soil or carbon, measured the age of a broken tool, the land's earliest memories were carried through stories. Across the Americas, indigenous traditions speak of people who lived here before the ancestors of present-day tribes arrived. These tales vary in detail, yet share a strange, persistent harmony. They describe earlier nations that shaped the landscape, taught skills, built structures, or moved silently through forests long before known histories began. The beings in these stories are not supernatural. They are simply old or different, in ways that suggest deep-time memory, not fantasy. In the Pacific Northwest, some stories speak of tall people who lived along the shores, leaving behind unusual stone shapes now scattered across the region. In the Southwest, there are accounts of ancient builders whose dwellings stood in cliffs before present cultures settled the area. Far deeper in the Amazon, traditions describe quiet forest dwellers who created earthworks long before current tribes existed. These tales endure with remarkable consistency, preserved through generations as carefully as a treasured tool. They are not treated as metaphors but as records, echoes of encounters with earlier populations whose traces have faded from the visible world. The narrator moves gently through these traditions with a tone of respect. Oral histories are not dismissed here, but understood as sophisticated memory systems. For thousands of years, before writing, stories were how communities protected their past. Through repetition, symbolism, and careful stewardship, these tales survived droughts, migrations, wars, and changes in landscape. They hold fragments of truth in forms that modern listeners may not immediately recognize, yet they remain anchored to real events that shaped cultural identity. The mystery grows quietly. How can tribes separated by enormous distances share similar themes? Why do so many speak of inheriting lands already touched by unknown peoples? Why do references to ancient builders, forgotten migrations, and early conflicts appear in regions with no archaeological record to support them? These parallels suggest that memory may stretch further back than the physical evidence we have uncovered. They imply that human presence in the Americas was layered, perhaps more complex than the standard narrative allows. These stories do not challenge science. They deepen the context around it. They remind us that archaeology uncovers only what survived by accident, while oral tradition preserves what mattered most to those who lived through it. The first ones may have been real communities, small, mobile, adaptable, whose ways of life left few permanent marks. Their legacy lingers not in stone or bone, but in the stories told beside fires, beneath open skies, long before any stranger wrote down the first description of these continents. As the chapter moves forward, these ancient voices guide us toward physical landscapes that seem to echo their memory. Hills shaped too deliberately, terraces hidden beneath soil, and structures half swallowed by nature hint that these stories may reflect real histories, waiting quietly to be uncovered now. Across the Americas, there are moments in the archaeological record when cultures seem to vanish without warning, leaving only faint traces that feel more like questions than conclusions. These disappearances rarely enter popular history, yet they shape the continent's past as deeply as the civilizations that endured. The silence surrounding them is unsettling, a reminder that survival is never guaranteed and that whole peoples can fade quietly into time. In the far north, early Paleo-American groups appear briefly in layers of ice-kissed soil before disappearing entirely, as if the cold swallowed their final footprints. Some may have migrated, following herds across changing tundra, while others may have succumbed to dwindling resources as glaciers retreated and reshaped the land. Whatever the cause, their presence ends abruptly, leaving no slow decline to study, only a sudden quiet. Farther south, the pattern repeats in different forms. Communities that once built irrigation canals or ceremonial sites vanish between layers, as though a page was torn from the story. Sometimes climate is the likely culprit. Drought tightens its grip, rivers shift, and once fertile valleys become inhospitable. Other times, volcanic ash blankets entire regions, forcing people to flee their homes with little more than memory. But some disappearances carry a deeper mystery. Archaeological sequences show cultural breaks that appear too sudden to attribute solely to nature. Pottery styles shift dramatically, tools change form, and long-held traditions vanish as if an unseen boundary had been crossed. Assimilation may explain some of these transitions, with smaller groups absorbed into rising societies, whose names survived while theirs did not. Yet the emotional weight lies not in the mechanics of disappearance, but in the knowledge that every vanished culture once carried its own world of meaning. Families lived entire generations, unaware that history would forget them. Their songs faded, their crafts dissolved, and their stories slipped into silence long before the first chroniclers arrived. What remains is an ache of absence, a reminder that disappearance is as natural to humanity as survival. And so, the record fractures again and again, leaving unanswered questions scattered like fallen leaves. These silences push us to look deeper, to search landscapes where traces still linger just beyond recognition. In following these absences, the journey leads directly into the next chapter, where the land itself begins to reveal what time has tried to hide. Each loss reshapes our understanding of what early America might have been. It challenges the idea that history moves neatly from simple to complex. Instead, it reveals a landscape of rises and falls hidden beneath time. Every disappearance opens space for imagination, for careful questions about origins. It encourages us to approach the past with humility, aware of its gaps. Even familiar regions may hold forgotten layers waiting quietly beneath the surface. Old riverbanks might hide abandoned camps. Forest floors may conceal ancient paths. Every overlooked corner invites a slower gaze, a willingness to wonder deeply. In these forgotten spaces, faint memories drift like dust illuminated by dusklight. Silence remembers. From a distance, the landscape seems honest. Hills roll gently, forests stretch without interruption, and riverbanks curve in the carefree patterns shaped by water and time. But when the gaze lingers, when the mind grows quiet enough to notice the subtler shapes beneath the obvious ones, something unsettling begins to appear. A hill that looks ordinary from the ground reveals a perfect symmetry when seen from above. A terrace hidden deep in a forest follows angles too precise to be the work of erosion. A riverbank bends in a straight line, an almost impossible geometry for a force that prefers to wander. These are the moments when the land starts to feel less like nature's creation and more like a forgotten memory. The narrator guides the viewer slowly, allowing the imagination to settle into the landscape's strange calm. Satellite images cast soft, muted colors across vast terrain, exposing patterns no traveler on foot would ever see. LiDAR strips away foliage like a whisper, brushing aside curtains, revealing shapes beneath the canopy circles, grids, embankments, and platforms that look eerily intentional. A forest floor, untouched by modern people, hides a city's outline. A prairie ridge masks what could have been a ceremonial mound. These discoveries do not demand conclusions, they invite questions. Centuries of rain smooth the edges of earthworks. Roots break down walls until they resemble natural ridges. Wind drags dust across structures until they sink into the soil. What once might have been bustling settlements become indistinguishable from the rolling land around them, swallowed slowly by time's patient hand. A place where thousands may have lived can vanish so thoroughly that only a faint rise in the ground remains, noticeable only to those who know how to look. Some landscapes feel almost too quiet, as if they are hiding the echo of something that once breathed there. A perfectly level platform sits in a valley where no known culture ever built large structures. Long parallel lines stretch across a desert floor, so even and deliberate that their purpose lingers in the air like a forgotten question. These shapes are not proof of lost civilizations, but they are reminders that the continents have been shaped by countless hands, many of which left no recorded story behind. This gentle mystery is not meant to rattle the viewer, it is meant to open a door. How many ancient settlements sleep beneath forests that grew over them? How many engineered landscapes now appear as simple hillsides? How much of what we call wilderness is actually the softened skeleton of worlds erased by weather, roots, and time? The land does not speak loudly, but it does remember. Its contours hold the final signatures of people who shaped the earth before written history arrived. And these quiet shapes lead naturally to what lies within them: structures, stones, and outlines that deepen the mystery. This is where the search continues, moving into the next traces of civilizations erased by centuries. Deep within the rainforests of the Americas, there are places where the ground rises in shapes too, even to be natural, where trees grow in silent rows that seem almost planned, and where the earth holds a geometry no living memory accounts for. At first glance, the jungle appears untouched, an endless quilt of vines, shadows, and living green. But when the canopy is peeled back by LiDAR, or the slow retreat of erosion, another world emerges beneath it, faint but unmistakable. Straight lines cut through the undergrowth where no trail should be. Plazas, once open and bright, lie buried under centuries of roots. Settlements appear as ghost outlines across the forest floor, their edges softened, yet still holding the imprint of human intention. The narrator drifts through this hidden world with a quiet, reflective tone. The air feels thick, not just with humidity, but with centuries of silence. These lost cities do not resemble the great monuments we recognize. They are subtler clusters of terraces, networks of roads, mounds arranged with quiet precision. Some may be older than the earliest known urban centers of the Americas. Others reveal layouts that do not match any culture recorded by history. It is as if entire civilizations rose, built, traded, worshipped, and then dissolved into the green without leaving a name behind. Nature plays the patient storyteller here. In the jungle, vines grow faster than stone can resist, and roots slip into every crack like water. A city abandoned for even a generation can disappear beneath a blanket of leaves. A century can erase almost all visible traces. The rainforest is a master of reclamation. It turns plazas into shallow basins of shadow, pathways into green tunnels, and stone into moss-covered memory. What survives does so only by accident. A collapsed wall here, a buried foundation there, fragments of intention peeking through the wild. The mind lingers on the people who built these places. Were they ancestors of cultures we later came to know, or were they separate nations with entirely different traditions? Did they leave willingly, migrating to safer ground as climates shifted? Or did disaster, disease, or conflict sweep through them silently? Their absence leaves not just archaeological gaps, but emotional ones. The jungle holds its secrets with a softness that feels almost protective, as if shielding the lives once lived beneath its branches. The narrator lets the viewer drift deeper into this green quiet, imagining torches once lighting pathways now smothered in vines, laughter echoing across plazas swallowed by silence, and marketplaces filled with voices long turned to dust. Each uncovered gridline feels like a door cracked open into a world we only sense through shadows. From here, the story must move outward. Rainforests are not the only places where civilizations vanished so completely. Just as jungles consume stone, deserts bury and reveal in different rhythms. The next landscapes offer their own mysteries, patterns in sand, lines in barren earth, and forgotten structures waiting beneath wide horizons. Deserts carry memory in a different way. Wind becomes the archivist, sand the quiet page. A single storm can bury a village so completely that its rooftops vanish under shifting dunes. Another storm, centuries later, may peel those dunes back again, revealing patterns that look almost deliberate. These traces feel like messages written in a language of shadows, where every faint line hints at earlier hands moving across a landscape that now appears empty. As the narrator moves slowly through the arid silence, the dunes behave like waves frozen in mid-motion. A spiral etched into the earth becomes visible only at dawn, when the sun strikes its ridges from an angle low enough to unveil its shape. A sequence of straight lines, too precise to be animal trails, too long to be natural, fractures stretches toward a distant horizon, disappearing beneath fresh layers of sand. These patterns do not offer explanations. They simply exist, patient and unhurried, waiting for someone to notice. Some of the most striking shapes lie beneath vast deserts, where no known culture should have left such marks. Foundation outlines appear where history records no settlements. Faint rectangles cluster near dry basins, as if ancient builders once arranged their homes around water that has not touched the surface in thousands of years. Forgotten irrigation channels map themselves across the land in ghostly grids, their purposes long erased. Each feature feels too exact to be accidental, yet the hands behind them remain invisible. The desert creates illusions, but it also preserves deeply. Because organic material decays quickly in arid heat, the small details of daily life have vanished. What remain instead are the large strokes, geoglyphs carved into gravel plains, pathways compacted by generations of footsteps, terraces cut into the edges of barren hillsides. These are the bones of forgotten engineering, the faint record of effort and intention. They suggest societies capable of shaping their surroundings, even if every other sign of their existence has dissolved into dust. The atmosphere becomes eerie in its stillness. It is easy to imagine the desert as a place abandoned by time itself, yet every pattern implies life where none is expected. The narrator invites the viewer to consider droughts that reshaped entire regions, migrations forced by vanishing rivers, and climatic cycles that swallowed whole cultures before recorded memory began. What we see today are the last outlines of those disappearances, landscapes holding on to fragments of stories they cannot fully tell. Some of these patterns may predate known civilizations by millennia. Others may represent short-lived societies that never grew large enough to leave recognizable artifacts. But in their quiet persistence, they reveal something powerful. Even the most remote deserts were once shaped by human intention. As the final grains shift in the wind, the viewer is guided toward the next part of the journey. If these ghost patterns hint at organized yet nameless societies, then the structures that endure beyond the dunes must offer clearer clues, physical remnants that sharpen the outline of lost civilizations waiting just ahead. Scattered across the continents are stones that seem to wait for someone who remembers them, They stand alone on windswept ridges, lie half-buried in quiet valleys, or rest on plateaus where nothing else suggests human presence. These structures do not belong to the civilizations we recognize. They have no temples nearby, no villages clustered around them, no inscriptions explaining their purpose. Their isolation is their mystery. They appear as if the world itself misplaced a chapter, one written in rock, then separated from every other page. Some stones are cut with angles too clean to be accidents. Others are arranged in patterns that catch sunlight at particular moments of the year, suggesting knowledge of the sky older than our timelines allow. A few align with distant peaks, or with solstice shadows that stretch like dark fingers across the land. Their craftsmanship is subtle, not grand. They do not resemble the monumental architecture of the Incas or Maya. Instead, they feel quieter, as if shaped by a people who worked with patience rather than power, leaving markers meant to endure but not to impress. The narrator moves slowly among these ancient forms, describing their surfaces weathered by frost and centuries of blowing sand. Moss fills their crevices in the north. Sun-cracked lichen paints their faces in the south. Over time, nature has taken ownership of them, softening edges and hiding details, yet never fully erasing the intention behind their creation. These stones keep their dignity even in ruin, holding secrets with the calm certainty of objects that have outlived their makers by thousands of years. What makes them haunting is not their craftsmanship but their loneliness. No tools surround them, no burial grounds lie nearby, no myths from surviving cultures claim them. They exist without context, like fragments of sentences whose language has been lost. Their presence hints at experiments in architecture, early attempts at structure, alignment, or ritual carried out by peoples whose identities dissolve so completely that only their stones remain. Rather than forcing explanations, the narration steps back, allowing the landscape itself to guide the imagination. Perhaps these stones marked seasonal gathering points. Perhaps they formed ceremonial lines used for watching the heavens. Perhaps they were teaching sites, or boundaries, or memories carved into earth by cultures who never imagined their world would be forgotten. Every possibility opens softly, never making demands, inviting the viewer to rest in the uncertainty. These isolated structures also remind us how fragile cultural continuity can be. A single drought, a shifting river, a long migration, or a quiet assimilation can erase a people while leaving behind just enough to tease the future. The stones endure, but the hands that lifted them do not. As the chapter ends, the quiet weight of these relics leads the narration toward a new storyteller water. Beneath lakes, rivers, and drowned coastlines lie other worlds where forgotten civilizations sleep under silt and shadow, waiting for their turn to surface in the story. The edges of the world have not always been where we see them today. Long ago, when the last ice age still held the continents in its slow, frozen grip, the oceans sat far lower than they do now. Shorelines stretched outward for miles, exposing vast plains that no modern map records. Beneath today's waves once lay valleys, forests, and winding estuaries where the earliest settlers of the Americas may have lived out entire eras of their history. It is a quiet thought, almost too large to hold. The first chapters of human life on these continents may rest in places we can no longer reach. The narrator moves gently across this ancient horizon, describing coastlines that drifted with the melting of colossal ice sheets. When the world warmed, water surged forward, reclaiming the lowlands in waves that advanced not over days, but centuries. Villages perched near ancient beaches were swallowed little by little, their homes collapsing into the rising tide. Campsites, pathways, and gathering places that once echoed with human voices now lie hundreds of feet below the surface, smothered beneath layers of silt and shifting sands. What survives of them would require diving into the dark, cold, quiet of underwater worlds, places where sunlight barely reaches and time seems suspended. As this idea settles, the viewer begins to understand the scale of the loss. Millions of square miles of potential archaeological landscapes were drowned. If the earliest American peoples preferred coastlines, as humans have always done, then much of their story now rests beneath waves that conceal everything. The seafloor becomes a sealed archive, its pages closed by the weight of water. The absence of early structures on land becomes less mysterious when we realize the land we search was not the land they lived on. The tone remains soft, guiding the imagination through submerged river deltas and the silhouettes of hills now hidden underwater. Each submerged valley feels like a forgotten stage, where human life once played out in full. Fires crackling at dusk, children running along the sand, fish drying on racks that no longer exist. These worlds were not mythical. They were simply erased by rising seas, leaving no witness but the ocean itself. And so, a quiet truth emerges. Our historical record begins only where the ocean stopped rising. Everything before that, perhaps thousands of years of settlement, innovation, and migration, sits beyond reach, preserved only as a faint possibility. It changes the way we see the map. It changes the way we see ourselves. The continents we know are merely the upper floors of a much larger structure, most of which lies locked away beneath shifting currents. This understanding opens the door to the next mystery. If so much land was drowned, what lies hidden there? The answer begins with the few underwater discoveries already found: ruins, paths, and shapes untouched by human hands for millennia. The journey drifts now from possibility into evidence, leading us deeper beneath the waves. Beneath the surface of the coastal waters, the world grows quiet in a way that feels ancient. Light drifts down in soft pillars, touching shapes that seem almost accidental, until the eye lingers long enough to see intention. Stone paths lie hidden under layers of silt, edges worn but still straight, as if guiding someone who has not walked those routes for thousands of years. Terraces rise from darkness like ribs of ancient architecture, each one softened by currents that have passed endlessly above them. Nothing here announces its story loudly, yet every line carved into these submerged structures hints at lives once lived where only fish now drift. Some discoveries rest close to modern shores, their shapes emerging during storms or unusually low tides, as if the ocean briefly loosens its grip on the past. Others lie much farther out, deeper than sunlight can comfortably travel, suggesting origins from a time when coastlines stretched miles beyond today's boundaries. Divers who approach these places describe a strange feeling, as though they are entering a memory rather than a ruin. Stones rest exactly where hands placed them long ago, untouched by looters, unaltered by later cultures, shaped only by the slow patience of the sea. The narrator moves through this underwater world with deliberate calm, allowing the quiet to speak for itself. There is no certainty here, only suggestion. A pattern of geometry too clean for chance, a row of stones too straight for accident. Along the coasts of the Caribbean, shapes resembling stepped foundations rest beneath blue silence, their edges softened but unmistakably intentional. Farther north, drowned forests and scattered stones hint at settlements built when the sea stood far lower than it does now. And along parts of South America, terraces hidden beneath shifting currents mirror the patterns of later highland cultures, though separated by impossible distances. Each discovery deepens the sense that the ocean did not merely erase history, it kept it. Cities may have stood on plains that are now seabeds, their fires extinguished by meltwater floods, their stories drifting into darkness as shorelines marched inland. These ruins beneath the waves remind us that the earliest chapters of human history may be waiting in places we can no longer reach. As we ascend from these submerged worlds, the mystery only deepens, leading toward stranger discoveries lodged in places where no civilization should have left a trace. The ocean's floor becomes a vast archive, preserving what the land could not, hiding entire landscapes beneath shifting currents and quiet tides. Here, stone circles rest where villages once stood, marking places where voices rose, children played, and fires burned against ancient evenings long forgotten. Even simple objects carry weight in this silence, for a single carved fragment found beneath the waves can overturn timelines built over decades. And yet the ocean reveals its secrets slowly, offering only glimpses of cultures swallowed by time, asking us to imagine worlds now hidden in blue darkness. Still, each fragment invites us to keep searching deeper. Beneath the surface of lakes, rivers, and drowned coastlines, objects rest in places that quietly defy the stories we tell about the past. A carved stone found where no settlement should have existed. A shaped tool lying beneath layers of silt hundreds of feet below modern sea level. A fragment of polished bone discovered inside a submerged cavern that has been underwater since long before written history began. Each object feels strangely out of place, as if it slipped through a crack in time and lodged itself in a world we thought we understood. The narrator moves gently through this submerged landscape, explaining that underwater discoveries are among the most difficult to interpret. Water does not preserve context the way soil does. It scatters, drags, buries, and repositions what it touches. Yet even within this uncertainty, patterns emerge. Along ancient coastal shelves now far beneath the waves, tools appear in layers too old to match the civilizations known to have lived nearby. In freshwater lakes, items surface during droughts or seismic shifts, objects that hint at villages long erased by floodwaters or glacial melt. None of these finds are grand in scale. They are small, quiet, and unsettling precisely because they do not fit neatly into any lineage. The tone remains grounded, never rushing toward dramatic conclusions. Instead, the script invites the viewer to imagine the lives behind these artifacts. People gathering shellfish along shorelines that no longer exist. Families building homes on beaches that were swallowed by rising seas. Travelers pausing beside river crossings now hidden beneath modern reservoirs. These tools, carved with care, were once part of daily life, used, carried, lost, and forgotten. When the waters rose, they sank deeper, settling into silt that would guard them for millennia. Rising seas did not simply cover land. They transformed entire worlds. Coastlines shifted by hundreds of miles. Estuaries expanded into bays. Forests drowned quietly under layers of calm water. The earliest human settlements, drawn naturally to coasts and river mouths, met these rising tides with no means to preserve their homes or memories. Their stories vanished long before modern archaeology could find them. The artifacts that remain are like faint lanterns glowing through dark water, visible, but impossible to reach fully. Some discoveries seem even stranger. A stone blade retrieved from a depth, suggesting an age before any known maritime culture existed in that region. A carved object found within an underwater cave that no one could have accessed after sea levels rose. These anomalies are often debated, but the debates themselves reveal something important. Our map of ancient human presence is incomplete, shaped more by what survived than by what was true. As this section closes, a quiet question lingers beneath the surface. If artifacts appear in places where no civilization should have been, what does that say about the paths people once walked? The narrative now moves toward those larger paths, zooming out to explore migration routes that challenge the boundaries of accepted history. Long before maps were drawn, before any known civilization marked the land with monuments or names, early peoples moved along the edges of a world that looked nothing like the one we know. Where coastlines now curve against the ocean, vast plains once stretched into the distance. Where bays and inlets shimmer today, forests and grasslands once rolled beneath the sky. These drowned landscapes held paths, harbours, and quiet gathering places that guided the first waves of humans across the continents. Now they lie under hundreds of feet of water, erased from sight, yet still faintly shaping our understanding of who walked here first. The narrator drifts along these imagined shores with a soft, steady voice, describing coastlines that existed when the sea was far lower. Early travelers may have followed these routes instinctively, moving along beaches rich with food, shelter, and warmth. These places would have been natural highways, broad, open corridors free from the dense forests and rugged mountains that later shaped migration. As the ice sheets melted and waters rose, such trails disappeared in slow, unstoppable silence. What remains are hints, underwater ridges that resemble causeways, submerged terraces that curve like ancient gathering spots, and patterns cut into the seafloor that seem too deliberate to be accidents. The idea is gentle, but deeply provocative. If the earliest migrations clung to coastlines now drowned, then the story of how humans spread across the Americas might be older and more complex than our current timelines allow. The first peoples may have moved swiftly, leaving few traces on the inland landscapes we can study today. Their camps, tools, and meeting grounds now rest beneath layers of silt, beyond the reach of easy exploration. Their footsteps, carried by rising waters, have become invisible. The viewer is guided into a quiet reflection. Humans have always followed the edges of the world. They have always moved toward opportunity, food, warmth, safety, shaping their journeys around the land's shifting contours. It is not difficult to imagine early nations flowing along those ancient coastlines, stopping at river mouths that are now deep offshore, exchanging knowledge at places long buried beneath waves. These forgotten routes may have connected groups far earlier than traditional migration models suggest, forming networks erased not by conflict but by time and tide. The tone remains soft, emphasizing that the past is not a straight line but a fluid story shaped by rising seas, climate shifts, and the fragile nature of human traces. What we know is only the portion left above water, the small remainder of a world once much larger. The drowned coastlines remind us that every chapter of human history is built on top of another, hidden beneath layers we may never fully uncover. As this thought settles, the narrative prepares to step into even darker territory. Not just submerged landscapes or forgotten migrations, but entire civilizations that vanished suddenly and completely, leaving the faintest imprint on the world before disappearing into silence. Across the Americas, the archaeological record rises and falls like a quiet heartbeat. For long stretches, cultures appear in steady rhythm, building homes, shaping tools, leaving patterns that tell of slow, familiar growth. Then, without warning, the pulse stops. A settlement that once showed signs of steady activity becomes an empty layer. Pottery styles that seem to flourish vanish in the very next stratum. Tools that appear in abundance suddenly disappear, as though the hands that shaped them were swept from the land in a single generation. These gaps do not announce themselves with drama. They settle into the soil with unsettling calm, leaving behind a silence that feels almost deliberate. The narrator moves softly through these absences, inviting the viewer to imagine what once filled them. A village that bustled with life one season may have been abandoned the next. A thriving coastal community might have watched the tides climb higher each year until its people fled inland. A valley that held generations of families could have experienced a drought so severe it forced entire populations to wander. None of these scenarios are extraordinary. They are simple truths of human survival. Yet their consequences leave deep voids in the archaeological story, voids that shape the way we understand the past. In some regions, pottery lines break so abruptly that it feels as if someone cut history with a knife. In others, the tools associated with a culture disappear before any sign of conflict or catastrophe emerges. These sudden silences echo across the continents from the far north, where Paleo-American groups vanish between layers of ice and meltwater, to the deep south, where early agricultural communities rise briefly and dissolve without leaving a clear thread to later cultures. The pattern is too widespread to be accidental. It reflects how fragile human traces truly are, and how easily the majority of a civilization's story can be erased by nature's slow reshaping. The emotional weight of these disappearances rests not in their drama, but in their quietness. Imagine a fire burning in a winter dwelling, its glow fading as the last family steps out for the final time. Imagine tools left behind, because the people carrying them meant to return but never did. These moments are not written down, yet they echo through the gaps in the soil. The archaeological layers hold what survived, not what mattered most. The chapter's core theme emerges gently. Disappearance is not an exception. It is a constant. Civilizations rise, adapt, struggle, and eventually dissolve into the same earth that once supported them. Their silence becomes part of the land's memory, faint but enduring. With this understanding, the narrator guides the viewer toward the next step, into specific, haunting examples of societies that vanished with such completeness that only scattered clues remain. What comes next reveals just how dramatic these silences can be, and how little we truly know about the worlds that preceded us. The story of the vanished cultures becomes even more delicate when we follow the traces left along ancient lakes. These quiet bodies of water once held entire worlds along their shores. Villages arranged in crescents around the tide line, small boats pulled onto muddy banks, smoke rising from morning fires. Today, most of these scenes have dissolved. Only the faintest shadows remain, a scatter of stones where homes once stood, the arc of an old fishing weir half buried in reeds, a depression in the soil that hints at a long-lost gathering place. These remnants do not speak loudly. They whisper in the soft, drifting way of water itself, revealing lives that existed intensely, then disappeared before a single legend could form. Some lakeside communities emerged with astonishing skill. Their tools show a deep understanding of fish migration, seasonal floods, and water cycles. They built traps that guided spawning fish into woven enclosures, engineered platforms that stayed dry even during storms, and shaped small, sturdy crafts from wood that rarely survives the centuries. Yet these people left no enduring monuments. Their structures were light, their presence gentle, and in what feels like the blink of an archaeological eye, they vanished. layers of sediment close over their footprints, and their ingenuity becomes just another puzzle submerged in mud. The narrator guides us across a fog-covered shoreline in imagination, asking us to picture the quiet moment when a lakeside village began to empty. Perhaps a drought drew the waters back, exposing cracked earth where fish once teemed. Perhaps storms grew stronger, ripping apart fragile homes. Or maybe the lake itself shifted, as lakes often do, breaching through a new channel, draining slowly into another basin, leaving behind a hollow landscape that could no longer sustain life. Whatever the cause, the result feels eerily sudden. Vibrant communities extinguished like candles in wind. Some of these lakes have since shrunk to ponds. Others have swollen into deep, silent basins, where old shorelines lie far below the surface. Archaeologists sometimes find fragments at impossible depths, objects too old to belong to known groups. These discoveries feel like messages that arrived late, drifting upward from eras no one remembers. They evoke a peculiar sadness, the realization that entire societies lived their days in harmony with water, only for that same water to erase nearly every trace of them. The emotional pull of these lost lakeside peoples lies in their fragility. Water nourished them, guided them, sustained their skill and rhythm. But it could turn just as easily, becoming the quiet force that swallowed their world. Their disappearance is not dramatic or violent. It is soft, like mist lifting from the surface of a lake at dawn. There one moment, gone the next. From this watery silence, the narrative rises toward the mountains, where other ancient cultures met their own mysterious ends. Their stories unfold under snow, wind, and stone, shaped by forces very different from the gentle erasure of shifting lakes. High in the thin air, where clouds trail like slow-moving ghosts along the ridges, traces of forgotten lives still cling to the earth. Terraces step down the mountainsides, with a precision that feels deliberate, even elegant, though no record tells us who shaped them. Stone platforms rest on narrow ledges, where the sky feels close enough to touch, their edges softened by centuries of frost. When the narrator drifts through these places, the mountains seem to watch silently, as if remembering a people whose voices once echoed across their peaks. These were societies that lived at the limits of breath and warmth, building homes in a world where winter could arrive without warning, and storms could erase a season's work overnight. At these heights, survival demanded cooperation, knowledge, and discipline. Fields carved from steep slopes suggest generations of trial and error, yet many of the oldest terraces have no connection to the cultures historians typically associate with Andean engineering. They appear older, lonelier, as if belonging to a chapter written before familiar civilizations rose. The thought is unsettling. Advanced mountain peoples may have thrived long before the societies we recognize, only to vanish when the climate shifted against them. The narrator moves slowly through this idea, letting the thin atmosphere seep into the mood. Mountain living magnifies every change. A slight drop in temperature can shorten growing seasons until crops fail. A single decade of harsher storms can make travel impossible. Glaciers can creep downward, swallowing pastures and sacred sites with equal indifference. Over centuries, these natural pressures accumulate like snow on a fragile roof. When the roof finally collapses, entire communities may be forced to descend, scatter, or disappear altogether. Some terraces show signs of sudden abandonment, stones left half set, irrigation channels never completed, ceremonial markers toppled but not looted. Villages appear to have been deserted without struggle, as if the inhabitants realized the mountain could no longer sustain them and left before the cold closed in. Others give the impression of deeper mystery. Pathways simply end. Storage pits hold remnants of food, but no final offerings. It is as though life ceased quietly, swallowed by ice and carried away by wind. The most haunting aspect is the absence of continuity. Later cultures used some of these terraces, but others remained untouched, too remote or too eroded to reclaim. Without names, without stories, without clear descendants, these mountain kingdoms drift into the same silence that hangs over every lost civilization. Their stonework stands like a heartbeat frozen mid-pulse, a sign of ingenuity that endured longer than the people who created it. As the wind slips through the ruins, the mountains whisper a reminder. Even the strongest societies can vanish when nature shifts beneath them. This idea leads naturally into the next question. What of the peoples who disappeared so completely they left almost nothing behind? The following section steps into the deepest shadows of loss, where entire nations fade from the record as if they never existed at all. Some disappearances haunt the archaeological record because they leave behind broken pottery, abandoned hearths, or half-finished structures. But the most unsettling vanishings are the ones that leave nothing at all. No walls, no tools, no burials, no smoke-blackened stones from forgotten fires. Only silence deep, unbroken, and absolute. It is within this silence that the idea of traceless cultures begins to take shape. Peoples who lived full human lives across vast stretches of land, yet slipped so completely into time's shadow that even their memory dissolved. The narrator moves gently through this quiet territory, where the landscape feels almost too empty. There are regions where evidence of early presence suddenly stops, as if entire populations simply walked out of history. Archaeologists sometimes detect faint hints, a genetic lineage that appears for a moment in ancient remains before vanishing forever, or a linguistic echo suggesting contact with peoples who have no archaeological footprint at all. These clues are fragile, like threads that fray the moment we try to follow them. Yet their very existence implies that real nations once lived here. Nations erased not by myth, but by the slow, merciless work of time. Some of these groups may have lived lightly on the land, building shelters of wood, reed, earth, or fiber materials that vanish within a season. Others may have moved frequently, never remaining long enough for permanent settlements to form. Mobility, in many ways, is an enemy of archaeology. A people who carry their world with them leave far fewer traces than those who anchor themselves in stone. Climate played its role as well. Floods can wipe away entire generations. Fire can turn homes to ash. Wind can grind fragile structures into dust. And in a continent shaped by shifting ice, rising seas, and unpredictable seasons, even the most established communities could disappear without leaving a mark. The emotional weight of these vanishings lies not in dramatic endings, but in their quietness. These were cultures with children, elders, rituals, laughter, fears, and dreams. They told stories by firelight. They watched the same stars we see now. They shaped tools, cooked meals, formed friendships, mourned their dead. Yet all evidence of these lives vanished so thoroughly that we cannot even guess their names. What remains is the humbling realization that most of human history has evaporated. What we study today is not the full story, not even the majority of it, but the small portion that survived accidents of preservation. This is the philosophical heart of the documentary. History is the record of what endured, not what existed. The missing chapters far outnumber the ones we hold. Forgotten nations once walked these lands, their footsteps worn into paths now swallowed by forests, their voices carried by winds that no longer remember the words. As this chapter fades, the silence deepens. Yet the emptiness is not the end of the story. Beyond the lost material traces lies another realm of evidence, one preserved by memory rather than soil. In Chapter 6, the voices that survived will begin to speak. Long before stone cities rose, or calendars marked the passing of seasons, memories were carried in the only vessel that could survive unchanged across thousands of years, the human voice. Around quiet fires, under winter skies, beside rivers that have since changed their course, countless generations repeated stories passed down from elders whose names are long forgotten. These stories traveled farther than any object, living through breath, rhythm, and repetition, until they became something deeper than memory. They became identity. In these lands, the oldest history was not written. It was spoken, sung, guarded, and carried with a seriousness we rarely understand today. The narrator moves gently through this world of oral tradition, showing how many indigenous nations preserve accounts of earlier peoples who walked the land before them. These first ones are not described as gods or spirits, but as real beings, builders, wanderers, or neighbors from a distant age. Some tales speak of strangers encountered at dawn, with unfamiliar ways of living. Others describe peoples who shaped the land in ways later tribes inherited without fully understanding. And many stories speak of those who vanished suddenly, leaving behind only faint traces that nature reclaimed. These traditions are not fantasies. They are memory systems designed for durability, structured to survive drought, migration, and upheaval. Their strength lies in repetition across generations, where each storyteller preserves the core while allowing the details to breathe. Even when the archaeological record grows silent, these memories remain steady. They preserve not only events but emotions, the awe of meeting an earlier people, the caution of encountering unknown travelers, the reverence given to ancient builders whose works barely survive today. The narrator describes this with a quiet respect, reminding the audience that these voices often hold truths that physical evidence cannot reach. In many communities, stories describe great shifts in the land floods that erased whole nations, fires that devoured forests, or ice that crept down mountains and forced migrations. These accounts align with real geological patterns, suggesting they may carry memories from ages when the world looked vastly different. Some traditions speak of ancient wars fought not against rival tribes, but against peoples older, quieter, and strange to later generations. Others tell of teachers who arrived from distant coasts, shared knowledge, and then disappeared. The mystery deepens not through exaggeration, but through the repetition of themes across vast distances. How can tribes who never met share echoes of similar stories? First peoples, ancient builders, vanished nations. The voices differ in language and detail, yet they gesture toward the same idea. The Americas were home to layers of human presence long before the cultures we study today. These oral histories become the bridge between silence and evidence. They fill the spaces left by time's erasure, offering glimpses of civilizations that archaeology has yet to uncover. As these voices fade into the background, the narrative turns toward the legends themselves. Stories that describe not only earlier people, but entire worlds beneath the surface of remembered history. Across the continents, stories flow like underground rivers, carrying memories older than any monument. Around fires, along riverbanks, and across windswept plains, Indigenous elders speak of peoples who shaped the land long before the ancestors of today settled their homelands. These tales are soft but steady, preserved through centuries of repetition. They describe builders who raised mounds with rhythms now forgotten, travelers who carved pathways across mountain ridges, and quiet nations who worked in harmony with the earth long before known civilizations emerged. The narrator approaches these stories gently, not as fantasies but as forms of record-keeping, oral archives passed through countless generations, enduring where stone could not. In the Pacific Northwest, traditions speak of the First Ones, a people who carved shapes into cliffs and departed without warning. Far to the east, Great Lakes tribes recall Earth Shapers, who constructed vast mounds before vanishing into the forest shadows. In the Amazon, river communities tell of ancient travelers who left behind patterns in the soil and geometric clearings that still puzzle modern researchers. These legends differ in detail, but share a deeper thread. The land was already inhabited, already shaped, already understood by earlier peoples, whose names dissolved long before written history began. The narrator treats these stories with respect, recognizing their purpose as cultural memory, not entertainment. Oral traditions rarely survive by accident. They endure because they hold truths considered important enough to repeat for hundreds of years. The presence of builders in these narratives suggests a layered human past, one in which civilizations rose quietly and left even more quietly, their traces scattered or absorbed into later cultures. The mystery lies not in the supernatural, but in the persistence of memory across vast distances. How is it that people separated by thousands of miles recall earlier nations who shaped the land and then faded? In these stories, the builders are not mythic giants or spirits, but human beings different, older, perhaps carrying traditions that predate the ancestors of the storytellers. Their skills appear advanced yet grounded, shaping earth into ceremonial mounds, aligning structures with celestial events, carving stone in patterns that still evoke purpose. The narrator lets the listener drift through these fragments like someone wandering along an ancient path at dusk, sensing presence without seeing form. These legends feel like the first bridge between archaeology and memory. They offer hints of civilizations that may never return to view through ruins or artifacts, but live on as echoes in human recollection. The storyteller's voice moves slowly, letting each tradition settle into the imagination, inviting the audience to consider what it means for so many cultures to remember people who left almost nothing behind. As these builders recede into the soft haze of distant ages, the narrative shifts toward another strand of memory, stories of travelers who crossed lands long before recorded migrations. Their footsteps lead naturally into the next section, where movement itself becomes a clue to civilizations now lost. They appear in stories like silhouettes moving across distant horizons, never staying long, never settling deeply, but remembered with a quiet respect that lingers through centuries. Many indigenous traditions speak of travelers who passed through the world before the ancestors of today's tribes took root. These wanderers are often described not as mythical beings, but as real people with unfamiliar ways. Strangers who spoke in rhythms that no living language matches, who carried tools unlike those later used, and who moved with a purpose that has since dissolved into the silence of forgotten ages. Their presence feels faint, yet the consistency of these accounts across vast regions gives them weight. The narrator moves gently through these memories, describing how stories from the Great Plains echo those from the far north, while tales from the Amazon mirror those of the southwest. Each tradition holds a thread: groups who traveled lightly, stopping only to rest, to hunt, or to exchange small gifts before continuing on. Some legends describe them as peaceful. Others remember brief conflicts or uneasy meetings. But nearly all agree on one detail: they were already there, walking the old paths long before the ancestors arrived. These stories carry an atmosphere of fog, as if the memories themselves drift at the edge of vision. They speak of travelers wearing garments woven in ways no longer practiced, or carrying baskets crafted with patterns no modern tribe recognizes. In some accounts, the wanderers carried fire in ways that seemed unfamiliar, or possessed knowledge of local plants that later peoples did not. Such details hint at lifetimes of experience, at cultures shaped by landscapes that may no longer exist, swallowed by changing climate or rising waters. The calm narration emphasizes that these tales are not fanciful decorations added for effect. They are historical vessels, oral record-keeping systems, designed to hold memory long after physical evidence has vanished. When elders recount the travels of those who walked before, they do so with the same seriousness given to recent ancestors. These wanderers may have been small bands of early migrants, scattered survivors of older nations, or groups following seasonal routes that predated later borders and territories. Whatever their origin, their stories remain embedded in cultural memory, preserved through ceremonies, songs, and fireside retellings. The emotional pull comes from imagining these early travelers as real people. Individuals waking beneath cold dawn light, tying their belongings into simple packs, and moving onward because the world demanded movement. Children learning the shapes of distant mountains. Elders pointing toward valleys where their ancestors once lived. Communities carrying knowledge that flowed like a river, but left few stones behind to mark its course. These wanderers are the moving shadows of prehistory. Neither conquerors nor builders of monuments, but threads that connected distant lands long before recorded time. Their memories linger not because archaeology preserves them, but because living people chose to remember. As the stories settle, the narrator guides the audience toward the next layer of ancient memory tales, not just of travelers, but of entire ages that came and went before the present world began. Across the Americas, stories speak of worlds that lived and ended long before the one we inhabit. These accounts, carried through ceremony and whispered in quiet gatherings, describe earlier ages shaped by forces that reshaped the land itself. They are not told as fantasies. They are recounted as memories fragile, symbolic, and deeply rooted in the experience of ancestors who watched entire chapters of existence close around them. When the narrator moves through these traditions, the line between myth and history begins to soften, revealing a landscape where memory and environment speak the same language. Some tribes speak of an age drowned by rising waters, when people scattered to higher ground as the sea reached toward the sky. Others recall a world consumed by fire, where the land cracked and the air turned dark. There are stories of an age of ice, when the land stiffened beneath endless winter, and only the most adaptable survived. These accounts echo patterns seen across the globe, cultures separated by oceans, yet united by memories of cycles ending and beginning again. Their similarity suggests that these stories may be older than any single people, reaching back to times when humanity witnessed dramatic changes that reshaped entire continents. The narrator describes these ancient worlds in tones as soft as drifting ash. There is no exaggeration, only the quiet weight of remembrance. A world washed clean by great floods might reflect ancient lakes rising after glacial melts. A world shattered by fire may recall volcanic eruptions that darkened the skies. An age swallowed by ice could preserve memories of advancing glaciers or sudden climate shifts, that forced whole populations to migrate or disappear. These stories become coded messages, recordings of survival, transformation, and renewal preserved across generations. Within these traditions, the listener senses more than catastrophe. There are hints of peoples who lived in those earlier ages, only to vanish when the world changed. Some accounts describe the ones before, who built homes now buried beneath lakes or sands. Others speak of teachers who walked across the land, guiding early humans before stepping back into silence. These fragments do not insist on literal interpretation, yet they open the door to the unsettling possibility that forgotten nations belonged not only to earlier centuries, but to earlier worlds, entirely worlds erased by the planet's shifting rhythms. The tone remains gentle, meditative. The narrator invites the audience to imagine standing at the edge of a world about to end, carrying stories forward like embers cupped in tired hands. The cosmologies suggest that humanity's past is not a single path, but a series of cycles, each age rising from the remnants of the last. What survived became the seeds of the present. What vanished became the soil beneath our feet. As these ancient memories settle into place, the next chapter returns to the physical world, seeking the networks, trails, and forgotten systems that hint at organized nations no longer visible, yet still woven into the land beneath us. Some paths stretch across the land with a confidence that feels out of place, as if they remember a purpose long forgotten. They wind through forests where no villages stand, cross plains where no cities rise, and climb mountain slopes with such deliberate ease that they seem older than the landscape itself. These ancient trails are too worn, too persistent, to be accidents of wandering animals or the casual passing of small bands. They feel intentional, etched into the earth by hands and feet that walked them so many times their passage became part of the terrain. Yet when archaeologists follow them, they often lead to silence, no settlements, no plazas, no structures waiting at the end, only the faint continuation of a route that once connected places we no longer know. The narrator steps into this mystery with quiet curiosity, treating each road as a question carved into the soil. Some run arrow straight for miles, ignoring the uneven logic of hills and valleys, as though designed for a scale of movement that seems excessive for small, isolated groups. Others twist gently, following contours with the kind of practiced familiarity that suggests generations of travelers knew every rise and hollow. These pathways feel like veins extending across the continents, lifelines of people whose stories have dissolved into the dust above them. Satellite imagery deepens the enigma. Lines barely visible from the ground emerge clearly from above, revealing networks stretching from one horizon to another. In deserts, the paths appear as faint scars beneath drifting dunes. In forests, they survive as subtle depressions or unnatural corridors, where trees grow differently, their roots tracing forgotten footsteps. Some pass through regions believed uninhabited during the time suggested by their age. Others intersect waterways or terraces built by later civilizations, suggesting that the newcomers inherited landscapes already shaped by unknown predecessors. What makes these roads haunting is not just their age, but their independence from recognizable history. They do not neatly align with the trade routes of familiar cultures. They do not lead to ceremonial centers we can identify. They simply exist, too solid to dismiss, yet too detached to categorize. Their builders left no monuments, no inscriptions, not even tools scattered alongside them. Only the roads themselves survive, stubborn and enigmatic. Walking along one of these trails, it is easy to imagine a different world. Travelers carrying goods we cannot identify, pilgrims making seasonal journeys to sacred sites that no longer stand, families migrating across vast distances, guided by knowledge passed orally and never written down. These possibilities linger in the quiet air like the memory of distant footsteps. These roads remind us that movement itself may have been the defining feature of early civilizations, fluid, adaptive, unbound by permanence. Their stories refuse to stay buried, even when everything else about their makers has vanished. If these pathways once linked forgotten nations, then the next question follows naturally. What networks of exchange and communication flowed through them? The search turns now to the traces of trade that survive in places where the people no longer do. Long before the rise of great cities and carved monuments, the continents were already threaded with quiet pathways of exchange. The objects left behind are small shells, stones, pigments, tools, but each one whispers of journeys that stretched farther than we once believed. A seashell discovered hundreds of miles from the nearest coastline suggests a hand-to-hand chain of travelers moving across forests and plains. A piece of obsidian found far from its volcanic birthplace hints at networks that reached across entire regions. Decorative stones, polished smooth by long use, appear in places where they do not naturally occur, as if carried by people who felt no hurry and followed routes now erased by time. The narrator speaks softly, describing these scattered clues not as isolated curiosities, but as part of an intricate web of movement. Early peoples may not have built large towns or permanent markets, yet their instinct to travel, trade, and share knowledge may have been far older and more widespread than archaeologists once imagined. These objects become like stars in a dark sky, individual points that, when connected, begin to reveal the shape of a forgotten constellation. The mystery deepens when the distances involved are considered. Some trade items traveled thousands of miles, moving steadily through landscapes where no recognized civilizations existed at the time. The exchanges were not chaotic. They followed patterns, flowing along river corridors, mountain passes, and ancient footpaths carved deeply into the earth. These paths, worn down by generations of travelers, became the arteries through which early ideas, technologies, and materials passed. The people who walked them may never have met the original makers of the objects they carried, yet they participated in a network that stretched far beyond their immediate world. The tone remains calm and grounded, resisting the urge to romanticize or exaggerate. It focuses instead on the simple truth of human curiosity. Even in the most ancient times, people sought what was rare, beautiful, or useful. They valued stone that fractured cleanly, feathers that shimmered in certain light, colors that brightened rituals or marked identity. These desires formed the backbone of early exchanges, long before writing or monumental architecture provided clearer evidence. Through these subtle objects, a picture emerges of forgotten nations connected not by cities but by movement. They walked from camp to camp, from valley to valley, following routes older than memory. Their exchanges left no markets, no currency, no treaties, only the quiet residue of connection carried across vast distances. These invisible trade webs reveal a world far more interconnected than our timelines suggest, a world where the earliest Americans may have shared materials and knowledge across immense landscapes. As the narrator draws the threads together, a new question arises. If objects traveled so far, what shared ideas or symbols might have traveled with them? This thought leads naturally into the next section, where the scattered language of ancient symbols hints at a deeper unity that once shaped the continents. Across the ancient landscapes of the Americas, symbols appear like quiet fingerprints left by hands we no longer know. Spirals etched into canyon walls, suns carved onto distant cliffs, animals painted in hidden shelters, and geometric shapes arranged with a precision that feels both deliberate and beyond easy explanation. They appear in deserts, forests, river valleys, and mountain corridors thousands of miles apart, as if scattered by a culture that moved across the continent long before any recognizable civilization emerged. The narrator drifts gently through these places, treating each mark not as mystery for entertainment, but as a doorway into a deeper human story. Some of these symbols rise from stone polished by wind and time, their edges softened, but their meaning still pulsing faintly. Others lie beneath layers of soil, revealed only when erosion uncovers the carved surfaces. Many exist in regions where no complex settlement has ever been found. The absence of cities or monuments around them makes the symbols feel even older, as if created during an era when people expressed identity and knowledge, not through architecture, but through marks made upon the land itself. These designs seem to breathe with the same calm rhythm found in early expressions of belief across the globe. The narrator's voice remains soft and reflective, never asserting grand theories. Instead, it suggests that these recurring motifs, spirals, radiating circles, stepped shapes, might represent shared understandings carried by groups who traveled far, or by cultures that inherited traditions from even earlier peoples. The symbols become threads, linking small communities separated by impossible distances, hinting at a memory that traveled farther than the people who preserved it. They whisper of stories passed down through generations, smoothing into abstraction until only their outlines survived. Some symbols appear at sites of apparent ritual significance, high plateaus, river crossings, cave mouths. Others are carved along ancient trails, as if meant to guide travelers or mark territories now erased. A few motifs seem to echo the movements of celestial bodies, as though early peoples recorded the turning of stars and seasons without leaving architectural proof of their knowledge. These marks reveal a level of contemplation not often attributed to societies that left no grand cities behind. The narrator pauses often, letting the viewer imagine artists crouched beside stone, tracing shapes that meant something essential to them. Perhaps the symbols were stories made portable, a way to bind communities together when writing had not yet been imagined. Or perhaps they were remnants of spiritual systems older than our timelines, allow beliefs carried by forgotten nations whose ways dissolved long before their symbols did. Whatever their origins, the designs feel older than the civilizations we understand. They linger quietly in canyons and on isolated rock faces, outlasting languages, migrations, and every human life above them. They remind us that creativity survives even when cultures fade, leaving faint yet stubborn clues about who came before. From these scattered patterns, the narrative moves toward the rituals that may have connected these early peoples, ceremonial pathways, and sacred landscapes shaped by hands that vanished before their stories could be told. Long before borders or kingdoms shaped the land, people moved across the Americas with a different purpose in mind. Their paths were not measured in miles or ruled by trade, but guided by places where the world felt thinner, where the ground itself seemed to listen. These ancient routes still linger, faint as worn threads woven through mountains, forests, and plains. At first, they look like ordinary trails, softened by time, but their patterns reveal a deeper intention. They link distant springs, caves, ridgelines, and hilltops with a precision that speaks to something more than survival. These were not roads for commerce. They were lines of devotion. The narrator moves gently through this idea, letting the landscape speak for itself. A narrow trail climbs toward a lonely summit where winds circle like a whispering choir. Another curls around an outcrop marked with carvings almost erased by rain. A third vanishes into a cave where light fades and echoes gather. The places connected by these paths feel like ancient stations on a pilgrimage route, each chosen for reasons we can sense, even if we cannot fully understand. The land carries the memory of footsteps that returned year after year, guided by beliefs older than the names we now give to these regions. Indigenous traditions still honor many of these sites. Some tribes describe them as gateways to earlier worlds, places where spirits linger, or where ancestors once crossed between realms. These stories rarely match across cultures, yet they share a consistent idea. Certain locations matter beyond practicality. They hold weight, significance, or a subtle pull that draws people toward them. And the routes between them often predate the tribes who continue to walk them. This is not coincidence, it is inheritance. Rituals can outlast languages. The section unfolds like a slow walk at dusk. The narrator imagines travelers moving across vast distances with offerings in handshell beads, feathers, painted stones following paths illuminated only by stars or memory. These journeys were not hurried. They were part of the rhythm of life, a cycle woven into the seasons. People gathered at sacred places to reaffirm bonds, settle disputes, honor ancestors, or greet the returning harvest. Such gatherings stitched the continent together long before recognized civilizations appeared. Over time, many of these pathways faded. Forests grew thicker, rivers changed course. Entire rituals were lost when the nations that created them dissolved into memory. But traces remain in the way certain sites align across great distances, as if once connected by a thread now invisible. These alignments do not prove a single unified religion, but they hint at shared spiritual sensibilities, passed quietly from one group to another, carried like embers along the trails. As the narrator steps away from these fading routes, a gentle realization settles in. Movement itself may have been the glue of forgotten worlds. Before cities anchored life, the land anchored belief. And as Chapter 8 begins, the story turns from spiritual pathways to the technologies and creative ingenuity these early peoples carried with them, innovations whose traces still surprise us today. When we imagine ancient engineering, we picture stone, pillars that defy earthquakes, walls that resist centuries of rain, monuments carved to outlast memory itself. But in most of the Americas, the earliest brilliance did not rise from stone. It grew from earth, wood, reed, fiber, and rope materials chosen not for immortality, but for harmony with the world around them. These creations were no less sophisticated. They were simply more fragile, dissolving back into the land long before the first archaeologist walked the soil. Their disappearance gives the illusion of emptiness, as if no great cities ever stood where forests now sway. Yet the land, if watched closely, still trembles with faint impressions of hands that knew how to build with remarkable skill. The narrator moves gently through this hidden landscape of vanished architecture. Imagine a vast village shaped from woven walls, its buildings breathing with wind, its framework bending like living bone. Picture elevated walkways suspended by ropes braided from plant fiber, stretching over wetlands now silent beneath thick mats of moss. Consider entire dwellings formed from packed earth, their domes rising smooth and warm, glowing at dusk like low embers against the horizon. These structures were not crude solutions. They were masterpieces of adaptation, light, strong, and perfectly suited to climates that punished stone, and preserved nothing that could not endure fire or frost. Time treated them with indifference. A wooden lodge that sheltered generations would vanish in a handful of seasons. A reed tower used for observing tides might dissolve in a single storm. Earthworks that once formed protective rings around communities would soften into gentle slopes, appearing natural unless glimpsed from the vantage of a bird or a drifting cloud. What has survived are only shapes, curves in the land, unnatural rises beneath the trees, patches of soil that remain unnervingly level. These are the shadows of innovation, not its ruins. The absence of material remains has shaped our imagination more deeply than we admit. We assume that complexity must leave monuments behind, but the first engineers of the Americas built with the logic of their environments. They understood that permanence is not always an advantage, and that materials which return to the earth may serve a people better than stone ever could. Their achievements were measured not in what endured forever, but in what functioned flawlessly in its own lifetime. If we could step back into those forgotten centuries, we might walk through settlements humming with intelligent design, ventilated chambers, heat-efficient hearths, elevated sleeping platforms, and water systems woven from living plants. None of these left ruins, yet all required skill, planning, and tradition. Their disappearance is not evidence of simplicity. It is evidence of a world where innovation lived quietly and vanished cleanly. As the fragile architecture dissolves in the mind, one truth becomes clear. To understand these forgotten nations, we must look not for stones, but for the refinements that endured in smaller forms. The next clues lie in the tools that survived objects so precise they hint at even greater knowledge now lost to time. Scattered across the Americas are objects so delicate and deliberate that they feel almost impossible. A stone point no thicker than a fingernail, flaked with such control that its edges look almost machine-cut. A bone needle slender enough to pass through the finest hide without tearing it. A polished sphere carved from minerals so hard that modern tools struggle to replicate its smoothness. These artifacts lie quietly in museum drawers and storage rooms, but when held under gentle light, they reveal the steady hands of people who knew exactly what they were doing. Their work was not crude experimentation. It was refined mastery. The narrator lingers on these small objects, allowing their quiet brilliance to speak. Each one carries the signature of a mind that understood texture, pressure, and rhythm. A single slip would have shattered the stone or snapped the bone. Yet the tools show no hesitation. They feel practiced, perfected, and familiar, as if the makers learned from generations of expertise we have no record of. These are not the inventions of societies just beginning to understand craft. They are the products of long traditions, passed down carefully through hands now lost to time. What makes them mysterious is not their existence, but their loneliness. They often appear without the settlements, workshops, or cultural footprints we would expect from such sophistication. A masterfully flaked point emerges from a site where only rougher tools should belong. A polished object lies buried in a layer that predates known stoneworking traditions. A bone needle appears in a region where no established weaving culture is thought to have existed. The artifacts feel like messages sent from civilizations we can sense but not see. The narrator keeps the tone soft and grounded, urging the viewer to picture the artisans behind these tools. A group working by firelight inside a shelter woven from reeds. A lone craftsperson sitting beside a river, shaping stone with slow, steady breaths. a community that understood materials intimately, how to fracture obsidian, how to smooth bone, how to polish mineral with patience instead of force. Their technologies were small in size, yet immense in knowledge. These objects challenge the assumption that complexity always grows upward from simplicity. Sometimes it appears out of sequence, like a bright star flashing briefly in the archaeological record before fading again. The tools suggest that technological traditions rose, peaked, and vanished in cycles long before the societies we recognize took shape. They hint at worlds where innovation flourished rapidly, then disappeared without leaving ruins or writing behind. As the narrator sets the final object back into its resting place, the question lingers gently. If such precision survived in these small fragments, what larger systems of engineering once stood behind them? The journey now broadens, turning from tiny marvels to the larger works of forgotten hands, structures, and systems that shaped entire landscapes before slipping into silence. Long before the great cities of the Americas carved their names into stone, earlier peoples shaped the land in quieter, more fluid ways. Their legacy hides not in towering monuments, but in the paths carved by water, a substance as soft as memory and as powerful as time. Across the continents, traces of ancient irrigation channels lie buried beneath layers of soil, following courses no modern farmer remembers. Reservoirs built with delicate precision rest under forests, their walls softened by centuries of roots. Fish traps made of stone still sit in rivers whose current has shifted, leaving the structures stranded far from where they once thrived. Each of these designs suggests a knowledge of water so intimate it feels almost forgotten. The narrator moves gently through these submerged histories, describing how early peoples directed streams with subtle embankments, guided floodwaters with terraces, and channeled seasonal rains into reservoirs that ensured survival during dry months. Such engineering requires planning, cooperation, and an understanding of landscapes passed down through many generations. Yet these waterworks often stand alone, isolated from any clear cultural context. They hint at civilizations that organized themselves with discipline and ingenuity, but whose names, languages, and stories vanished long before the first chroniclers arrived. Some of these systems are so ancient that later cultures built directly upon them. A canal dug by unknown hands becomes the foundation for a newer one. A reservoir carved in a bygone age continues collecting rain centuries after its builders moved on. And certain fish traps still function today, their stone walls guiding currents with an elegance that feels almost modern. These remnants demonstrate a deep mastery of environment, proving that engineering is not merely a matter of tools, but of understanding rhythms, how water flows, how seasons breathe, how land responds. The calm narration lingers on the mystery of origins. Who conceived these networks? Who decided where water should run, and how far it should travel? Why do some systems show levels of precision that exceed the expectations for their era? The tools that shaped them have long dissolved. The people who tended them have left no visible trace. Only the patterns remain, etched into rivers and valleys like signatures written in motion rather than stone. The emotional pull arises from imagining the daily lives behind these designs. Families gathering water from channels their ancestors carved. Farmers watching the first seasonal flood fill their fields. Fishermen setting traps at dusk, trusting structures that had functioned for generations. These were not simple societies. They were organized enough to move water, disciplined enough to maintain systems, and knowledgeable enough to anticipate the needs of future seasons. Yet their presence has become a quiet shadow. They did not leave monumental architecture, but they shaped the world in ways still visible to those who know how to look. Their designs remain practical, humble, and enduring proof that forgotten nations once commanded the rivers, guiding them with a precision lost to time. From these flowing signatures, the story turns towards something more delicate, the artistry of unknown hands, whose creations outlasted their makers in ways both beautiful and haunting. Across the scattered layers of the ancient Americas, beauty appears long before its makers come into view. A shard of pottery rises from the soil, with patterns so delicate they seem almost modern. A carved flute emerges from a cave floor, its surface polished to a soft gleam by hands that vanished thousands of years ago. A woven fragment, impossibly fine, lies preserved in dry earth as if it were waiting to be recognized. These objects do not belong to the great civilizations we can name. They surface quietly in places without palaces or temples, as if the land itself holds pieces of a forgotten gallery curated by time. The narrator moves slowly through this hidden world of craftsmanship. Pottery styles appear in the archaeological record, with startling suddenness, sophisticated designs blooming without earlier prototypes. Musical instruments show an understanding of acoustics far deeper than expected for their era. Textiles display patterns so intricate that they hint at established traditions, not experimental beginnings. These objects feel older than the societies traditionally credited with advancements in art and skill. They suggest something deeper, that creative brilliance existed long before the timelines we now follow. In many regions, the spread of certain motifs seems impossible to explain through known cultural connections. Spirals, crosshatches, stepped lines, and stylized animals appear across continents, separated by deserts, mountains, and vast stretches of forest. They are not identical, yet they share a quiet kinship, as if echoing a symbolic language spoken long before written memory. The people who made them left no monumental cities or enduring architecture. Their presence is found only in the grace of their hands, the curve of a line, the rhythm of a carved groove, the harmony within a painted bowl. These fragments act like fingerprints pressed into time. They remind us that early human societies were not simply surviving, they were shaping, decorating, and expressing. Creativity did not wait for urban centers or centralized power. It flourished in small communities, in nomadic groups, in settlements that breathed for a generation or two before fading. Their art outlived everything else. The makers are gone, their names unrecoverable, but the patterns remain quiet, testaments to lives lived with skill, purpose, and imagination. The narrator asks the audience to imagine these forgotten artists. A potter sitting near a riverbank, smoothing clay beneath the soft morning light. A musician carving a flute to call distant spirits or bring comfort to a restless night. A weaver bending over fibers, tying meaning into every strand. Their stories did not survive in chronicles or carved stelae. They survived accidentally, through the resilience of the objects they touched. As the chapter's final brushstroke settles, a new question rises softly from the silence. If these artistic traditions belong to cultures we no longer recognize, what other identities, customs, and lifeways have been lost with them? With that lingering thought, the journey shifts toward Chapter 9, where the search for who these ancient peoples might have been begins in earnest. At the far edges of the last ice age, where cold winds curled across empty plains and twilight seemed to linger a little longer each day, the first peoples of the Americas shaped lives that now feel impossibly distant. They moved through a world still half-formed, its rivers young, its forests fragile, its horizons stretching beneath an enormous sky untouched by story. Mammoths wandered across frozen grasslands. Caribou carved winding paths through frost-hardened earth. And somewhere among these ancient rhythms, small human communities built their fires, tended their tools, and watched the glowing embers reflect off endless sheets of ice. Their presence feels like a faint warmth inside a vast and wintry silence. We imagine them only through fragments, a buried spear point flecked with traces of ancient blood, a hearth ring frozen in sediment, a scattering of footprints pressed into soft mud that hardened into stone long before modern eyes discovered them. These tiny clues whisper of people who had already mastered survival thousands of years before the civilizations we celebrate emerged. They understood the migrations of great animals, the turning of seasons long lost, the narrow windows when the ice loosened its grip. Their world demanded constant awareness, and in that struggle, they created cultures that thrived without leaving the monumental marks we rely on to tell history. The land they inhabited was always changing. Ice sheets advanced like slow-moving walls. Valleys opened only to close again beneath drifting snow. Rivers formed, shifted, and carved away traces of campsites. Whatever these early peoples built, shelters of wood, bone, and hide stood only briefly before collapsing back into the earth, leaving nature to erase the outlines of their lives. Time transformed their homes into nothing more than altered soil. Their belongings, carried with them across long migrations, rarely survived the cold. Even their graves, if they buried their dead at all, slipped beneath layers of wind-blown dust and melting permafrost. Yet the emotional weight of their existence remains. In imagined scenes of flickering firelight reflecting off ice crystals, we sense a depth of humanity that transcends the sparse evidence. They laughed, feared, argued, hoped. They told stories beneath dark skies where the auroras rippled overhead like living spirits. Their traditions, formed in the hard clarity of an ice age dawn, may have set the foundations for later cultures who would one day cultivate fields, build mounds, and carve temples. The earliest nations did not vanish, they flowed forward in blood and memory, though the land swallowed nearly all material traces of their passing. These forgotten lives hover just beyond our reach, like shapes shifting behind fog. They suggest that the story of the Americas begins not with agriculture or monumental architecture, but with determined families crossing frozen thresholds into new worlds. Their echoes remain faint but persistent, urging us to consider how deep this continent's past truly runs. From these icy beginnings, the narrative moves toward the coastlines, where early maritime peoples forged warmer, more fluid lives following tides instead of glaciers, and leaving behind clues now hidden beneath the rising seas. Long before the shorelines settled into the shapes we recognize today, the coasts of the Americas stretched far outward into lands now hidden beneath the sea. Along those vanished edges moved some of the earliest peoples, small groups navigating by instinct, tide, and the faint memory of stars. Their world was a long, wandering coastline, a boundary between land and water that shifted endlessly with rising ice, falling glaciers, and sudden storms. They traveled lightly, leaving behind only what the oceans chose to keep. At night, their fires flickered across beaches now drowned, warm circles of light that once held families' hopes and stories no longer spoken aloud. The narrator moves softly along those forgotten shores, imagining the rhythm of life in a time when the sea was both guide and danger. These early wanderers likely built shelters of woven reeds and driftwood, easy to assemble and easy to abandon when the tides changed. Their boats were simple but strong enough to cross inlets and trace the patterns of currents. Food was plentiful: fish, shellfish, seabirds, kelp forests rich with life. Yet their settlements were never meant to last. The coastline itself was a living thing, swallowing the places where they paused and exposing new ones in the same breath. The evidence that remains is faint, but it is there. Ancient fish traps appear in places where no modern tide should reach. Shell middens, now buried deep within coastal sediments, reveal long-ago meals eaten beside waters that have since engulfed entire valleys. Tools made from bone and stone wash up after storms, carried upward from depths that scientists cannot yet explore fully. Genetic signatures hint at early coastal migrations, small windows into the movement of peoples who travelled far earlier than our timelines comfortably allow. The beauty of these clues lies in their fragility. They feel like messages that survived by accident rather than design, reminders that history is shaped not only by what endures, but also by what the sea decides to return. These ocean wanderers may have been the first Americans peoples whose knowledge of tides and seasons guided them across the continents long before agriculture took root or monumental architecture rose from riverbanks. Their disappearance was not a single moment, but a slow erasure. As the Ice Age ended and glaciers released their stored water, sea levels rose hundreds of feet. Campsites vanished beneath waves. Pathways disappeared under salt and silt. Entire lifetimes sank into darkness before the world had begun to record itself. What remains now are hazy imprints, echoes of journeys made along coasts that no longer exist. Yet these wanderers did more than move. They connected. Their paths linked distant regions, carrying stories, genes, and traditions across thousands of miles. Their presence shaped what came after, even if the land has forgotten their names. As the tides fade in the mind, the story turns inland toward the first farmers, those who shaped the land in quiet ways, before their own cultures, too, slipped from view. Long before the great agricultural civilizations of the Americas carved terraces into mountainsides or built cities aligned with the stars, there were smaller, quieter societies who learned to coax life from the soil. Their names are gone, their traditions unrecorded, yet their presence lingers in the earliest seeds ever touched by human hands. In forgotten valleys and river basins, they planted the first gardens, not knowing that their simple experiments would one day reshape entire continents. They tended plots of squash and beans long before the Olmec raised their first ceremonial mound, long before the Chavin sculpted stone, or the Maya aligned their temples with the rising sun. These early farmers moved through dawns no longer visible to us, their routines erased by the slow patience of time. The land remembers faintly. A patch of unusual pollen deep in sediment hints at ancient horticulture. A rare species of squash appears suddenly in layers far older than expected. Scattered grinding stones lie just beneath the Earth's surface, worn smooth by hands that never imagined their tools would outlive their families, their stories, their entire way of life. These fragments whisper of societies that rose gently, lived quietly, and vanished without leaving the monuments that make history easy to see. Their homes were light woven walls, wooden beams, roofs made from reeds or thatch. Structures like these do not survive storms or centuries of shifting soil. They melt back into the earth, their shapes dissolving until even the memory of their existence is lost. What remains are the faintest signatures, the altered genetics of a domesticated plant, the shape of a field long buried beneath landslides, the charred remains of ancient seeds preserved by luck alone. Yet these early communities were not primitive wanderers. They understood the arrival of seasons, the rhythms of rain, the patience of growth. They learned which crops thrived under heavy clouds and which required more generous sun, passing this knowledge from mother to daughter, from elder to apprentice. In the quiet hours before dawn, they likely walked among their fields, checking the soil for signs of promise or warning. They were experts in a world that no longer exists. When change came, drought that lasted too long, a river that shifted course, a cold snap that stunted every plant, they had little choice. Some may have migrated, carrying seeds in woven pouches. Others stayed until survival became impossible. Their villages emptied slowly, fires extinguished one by one, pathways fading beneath new growth. Whether absorbed into later cultures or scattered into nothingness, their legacy survived only in the plants that continued to evolve. In the soft light of this forgotten past, these first farmers feel like distant relatives whose names we misplaced. They shaped the land long before history began keeping track, offering the earliest hints that complexity existed far earlier than we usually imagine. Their disappearance opens the door to the most provocative question of all. If they achieved this much so early, what other forms of early civilization might have risen before the first known cities? Long before the names we associate with ancient America, long before the Olmec built their stone heads, or the Chavin carved their temples into mountain stone, there may have been places where people gathered in numbers large enough to reshape their surroundings. Not cities in the way we imagine them today, but early experiments in living together, sharing labor, and organizing life around a central space. These places lie deep in the archaeological record, their outlines faint, their timelines uncertain, and their stories barely visible through the dust of millennia. Yet when the ground is peeled back in carefully measured layers, something unexpected appears. Signs of communal life older than the civilizations we consider first. The narrator enters this world with a soft, steady tone, inviting the viewer to picture a dawn that broke thousands of years before anyone carved writing into stone. In this dawn, clusters of homes formed around open plazas. Earth mounds aligned with the movements of the sun marked the passing of seasons. Communal platforms rose from soil shaped by many hands, their purpose lost but their presence unmistakable. These features do not shout grandeur. They whisper organization, people coming together with intention, structure, and rhythm. Some sites show evidence of gatherings large enough to suggest ritual or shared governance. Others reveal remnants of food preparation on a scale beyond that of a single family or clan. The patterns are there, quiet and persistent, even if the names of those who created them have vanished. Scholars debate how to interpret these places, whether they were seasonal meeting grounds, early ceremonial centers, or the earliest forms of settled communities. But the debate itself highlights the deeper point. Something was happening long before the civilizations we teach in classrooms. The mystery grows as the narrator lingers on the fragile nature of such early urban experiments. Many were built with earth, wood, or fiber materials that surrendered easily to rain, roots, and shifting ground. A few centuries of neglect could erase all but the faintest outline. A single flood could scatter every trace, yet the traces that remain are enough to raise a quiet question. How many early cities lived short, bright lives before vanishing without descendants? Imagine a sunrise over such a forgotten settlement. Smoke rising from communal fires, footsteps crossing a plaza packed firm by years of gathering, children learning stories now lost, elders watching the horizon with eyes that had never heard the names of the cultures we now call ancient. These people lived full lives in a world moving slowly toward the civilizations we recognize. Their cities, if we can call them that, were stepping stones toward futures they would never see. This section closes with a gentle reminder. The Americas' first stories stretch deeper than we have dared to explore. And as these early cities fade into shadow, the narrative prepares to draw their echoes together, moving into the final chapter, where forgotten nations become mirrors, reflecting what we still struggle to understand about our own place in time. Memory is the thinnest thread holding the past to the present. It stretches across generations, fragile as a strand of smoke drifting above a candle flame. Civilizations rise upon it, trusting that their stories, their triumphs, their fears will travel forward through time. Yet most do not. Most fall into silence so completely that even their names dissolve. When we look back across the ages of the Americas, the quiet becomes almost overwhelming. For every culture we can study, countless others lived and vanished without leaving a trace that survived long enough to be seen. Their thoughts, their songs, their rituals, their hopes, entire worlds of meaning faded like footprints under the slow tide of centuries. The narrator's voice softens, inviting the viewer to imagine the immensity of that loss. How many fires were lit that no one remembers? How many philosophies were spoken in words that never found a place in clay or stone? Human existence is full and vivid even in the smallest communities, yet only the rarest fragments are preserved. A shard of pottery here, a portion of woven fibre there, a bone tool spared by chance rather than intention. These are not the stories themselves, only faint reminders that stories once existed. Memory depends not only on what is recorded, but on what survives long enough to be recorded. Most of our ancestors lived in ways that left the lightest touch upon the land. They built with materials meant for life, not legacy. When storms came or rivers shifted, their traces were wiped clean. When forests reclaimed valleys or coastlines sank beneath the sea, entire worlds vanished into mud and salt. What remained was silence, vast, unbroken, and strangely intimate, like the quiet left after a whispered conversation you were never meant to hear. This realization reshapes how we view the past. Forgotten nations are not unusual, they are the norm. The mystery lies not in their disappearance, but in the tiny handful we remember. Those few civilizations whose architecture endured, whose traditions were written, or whose relics were preserved by miraculous accident, form only the surface of a far deeper human story. Beneath them lie layers of unseen lives that shaped continents without leaving durable proof of their presence. The emotional weight grows as the narrator reflects on this truth. Modern people often assume they stand at the end of a long, clear chain of knowledge. Yet the chain is broken in more places than it is intact. Our histories are patchworks, stitched from surviving pieces that misrepresent the vast seas of silence between them. Humility becomes the only honest response. To look at the past is to acknowledge how much has slipped beyond our sight. This gentle reflection opens the doorway to the next idea. If so much has been forgotten, then perhaps our understanding of progress, invention, and human resilience is incomplete. Perhaps the rise and fall of civilizations is not a march forward, but a cycle of creation and erasure. The next section steps quietly into that deeper realization. History is often presented as a staircase, each step rising neatly from the one before it, as though human progress followed a predictable rhythm. But when we look closer, beyond the surviving ruins and the preserved texts, the pattern dissolves. There are long stretches where innovation appears out of nowhere, peaks briefly, and then fades without leaving clear descendants. There are eras where brilliance is followed not by improvement, but by forgetting. It becomes difficult to believe in a simple upward line when the archaeological record is filled with breaks, resets, and quiet disappearances. The narrator lingers on this uncertainty, letting it settle into the listener's mind like a soft echo. Forgotten nations remind us that the story of civilization is not a single tale, but a collage of overlapping worlds. Some rose early, experimented boldly, and vanished before their knowledge could anchor itself into stone. Others survived for generations, only to be erased by storms, shifting climates, or the slow pressure of time. Even the cultures we recognize today, those celebrated in textbooks, stand upon foundations built by hands we cannot name. Their achievements did not begin from nothing. They grew from a heritage that slipped into silence long before anyone carved symbols into rock. There is a quiet humility in acknowledging this. It forces us to reconsider the idea of advancement, not as a constant climb, but as a fragile dance between memory and forgetting. Techniques discovered in one age might disappear entirely in the next. A tool perfected thousands of years ago may be reinvented centuries later as if for the first time. Knowledge does not move in straight lines. It flows, retreats, and occasionally pools in unexpected places. The hidden chapters of human storytelling lie in these lost streams, civilizations that mastered their environments, navigated vast distances, or built with materials that time erased completely. Their innovations might have influenced later cultures indirectly, passing through oral traditions or subtle practices that endured while their names did not. Other knowledge may have vanished entirely, leaving only faint hints that something greater once existed. The world we inherit is shaped not only by what survived, but by everything that disappeared along the way. This understanding adds a new dimension to the mystery. It suggests that human history is filled with unseen experiments, forgotten discoveries, and lives that carried wisdom now beyond our reach. It means that every tool, every structure, every myth preserved in memory may be the last surviving piece of a much larger puzzle. And it reminds us that we, too, are part of this ongoing cycle, builders of a chapter whose edges may fade, whose details may soften, whose achievements may one day feel distant and unreal. As this realization settles, a gentle question rises. If so much has been forgotten, what else have we yet to uncover? The contemplation leads naturally into the next section, where the very nature of memory and why it fails becomes the heart of the mystery. The quiet returns at the end, the same way it greeted us at the beginning. A soft stillness settles over the landscapes of the Americas, as if the continent itself is exhaling after holding secrets for far too long. In that stillness, the past does not rise in full images or recovered monuments. It appears instead as a gentle echo, something that vibrates faintly beneath the surface of ordinary life. An old path cutting through a meadow, shaped by feet that walked long before names existed. A pattern of fields etched into a hillside, grown over yet still visible when the light tilts. A river that bends in a way that mirrors a forgotten settlement. The traces are small, but they tug on the imagination like distant sounds drifting through a half-open window at night. The narrator lingers in this atmosphere, reminding us that history is not only what we can see, it is also what moves through us, the habits we inherit without knowing, the crops domesticated by unknown hands, the stories carried through generations like fragile embers. The first peoples, the early farmers, the mountain nations, the coastal wanderers, none of them vanished entirely. Pieces of their choices still ripple across the present. A seed they cultivated becomes a staple. A trail they cleared becomes a highway. A tool they shaped evolves into a new invention. We often do not recognize their fingerprints, yet they remain. The echo does not speak in sentences, it speaks in rhythms. It appears in the way settlements spread along ancient corridors of movement, as if following invisible lines drawn by ancestors no one remembers. It appears in the migrations that shaped bloodlines, weaving together groups who never knew the names of those who came before them. It appears in languages that hold strange, ancient fragments, syllables that drifted across continents long before recorded history began. Even in modern societies, faint reflections of these forgotten nations continue to glimmer, subtle enough to escape notice, but persistent enough to survive. There is comfort in this continuity. The civilizations that disappeared did not vanish into emptiness. They dissolved into the world that followed. Their knowledge blended into the traditions of later cultures. Their mistakes shaped the choices of others. Their journeys left paths that new travelers continued to walk. The world today is not built on blank ground. It rests on countless hidden foundations, each one a quiet contribution from people whose stories were carried off by time. In this way, the echo becomes a reminder rather than a loss. It teaches us that history is never a closed book. It is a river made from many unseen streams, each feeding the next, without needing to be remembered by name. And as we listen to that faint current, flowing softly beneath our feet, the final truth emerges. These forgotten civilizations are not truly gone. They continue, quietly shaping the world long after their voices fell silent. This understanding leads us gently toward the documentary's final reflection, a question about what we choose to remember and what we allow to fade. The journey ends the way all great mysteries do, not with a door closing, but with another one quietly opening. As the narrator steps back from the landscapes, artifacts, voices, and shadows of vanished nations, a gentle truth rises from the silence. Uncovering the past is never about certainty. It is about widening the circle of what we are willing to wonder about. Across the Americas, beneath forests, deserts, grasslands, and drowned coastlines, the earth still holds layers of stories waiting for the right moment to surface. Some may never emerge fully. Others may appear unexpectedly, carried upward by shifting soil, wandering roots, or chance discoveries made by ordinary people simply paying attention. History, in this light, becomes less a fixed record and more a constellation points of brightness scattered across a vast darkness. What we have explored are only a few of those lights. The forgotten nations that walked these continents left fewer traces than later civilizations, yet their influence is woven into everything that followed. Their migrations shaped new lineages. Their innovations seeded forgotten traditions. Their understanding of the land allowed later peoples to thrive. Even when their names faded, their presence continued quietly in the foundations of the world we inherited. The narrator invites the viewer to imagine the discoveries still waiting beneath quiet riverbeds, beneath fields turned each spring, beneath the silted remains of old lakes. Perhaps a forgotten tool lies only inches away from the surface. Perhaps a long-lost settlement sleeps beneath dunes that shift with every passing season. Perhaps a story preserved in ceremony or legend holds a memory older than any ruin. These possibilities create a calm excitement, an awareness that humanity's journey is far from complete. The section softens further, pressing gently against the idea of responsibility. History is not a relic to be stored behind glass. It is a living mystery that asks for curiosity, humility, and care. The viewer is encouraged to see themselves not as distant observers, but as participants in an ongoing search. New knowledge will come, not all at once, but slowly, like distant stars revealing themselves when the sky grows perfectly still. Some revelations will challenge what we think we know. Others will deepen the beauty of what remains unknown. The tone settles into a serene cadence as the story prepares to close. Forgotten nations become less like historical puzzles and more like companions, quiet presences walking beside us, reminding us that silence does not mean absence, and that the ground beneath us is layered with meaning. Their stories rise like faint echoes carried on wind, urging us to listen with patience, to walk with wonder, and to honor the worlds that came before our own. As the final lines drift into the dark, the narrator leaves the audience with one lingering thought: the past is never finished. It waits in the soil, in the sea, in the memory of the land itself. And the next chapter, whatever it holds, belongs to those willing to step forward and listen.